Okay, so in this video, we're going to look at a few more what we're going to call limited or constitutional monarchies. So remember that the idea of a constitutional monarchy is one in which the monarch is limited in their abilities. Now, how they are limited depends on the place. So, who limits them, how they're limited, that can vary from place to place. But when we think about a limited monarchy or a constitutional monarchy, the monarch is limited in what in what they can do. There are boundaries for the monarch. So the best example of a constitutional monarch is, of course, the English monarch, which we've spent some time looking at. But now we're going to look at a few other places with a limited monarch. And the first one that we're going to look at is the Netherlands. So we've kind of been dancing around the Netherlands for a while. They've kind of woven themselves in and out of our story a little bit. The key thing to remember about the Netherlands is that here, rich merchants limit what the monarch can do. So in England, it was the nobility. In the Netherlands, it's these rich merchant families that limit what the monarch can do. So let's do a little bit of background on the Netherlands just to kind of refresh our memories. Remember that, so we'll do a little bit of background slash review. Remember that this was originally territory controlled by the Spanish Habsburgs. And this territory was known as the Spanish Netherlands. However, the people who lived here mostly adopted Calvinism as opposed to the Spanish Catholicism. And remember that this led to a big series of conflicts that we kind of collectively know as the 80 Years' War. And maybe the highlight of the 80 Years' War was the Spanish Armada. Hopefully all of this is kind of ringing a bell. The Peace of Westphalia gave what were known as the United Provinces, what we know as the Netherlands, independence. Now, this wasn't the entirety of the Spanish Netherlands. The United Provinces was only the northern half. The southern half is now called the Austrian Netherlands. And eventually, in the 1830s, This will eventually become Belgium. But for the time being, and for all of time period 2, this is Austrian territory. Now, it's well outside the borders of Austria, and Austria doesn't really like the fact that they've got this piece of Austria that is surrounded by their enemies, like the French and the English. But for right now, it's Austrian territory, kind of far away from the Austrian homeland. We're not going to worry about this part for now. Eventually, we'll talk more about Belgium when we get to the age of nationalism, and when they finally get independence, we'll bring them back into the story. Now, even though these guys were Calvinists, the Netherlands welcomed religious refugees from throughout Europe. Many of them are Calvinists. So many of these refugees are Calvinists, but there were a good number of other Protestants and a fair number of Jews as well. So most of these refugees are Calvinists, mostly coming over from France. This is also where we see some of the Puritans go before they make their journey to North America. One other bit of background about the Dutch. These guys were really good at shipbuilding. And I guess trade technologies. And because they were already united, they got a head start on trade in the commercial revolution. So once economies in Europe kind of shift over to trade as a kind of going away from agriculture and moving towards trade in the commercial revolution, the Dutch already kind of had a head start on everybody else. They were already really good at shipbuilding and trade. And once the economy of Europe kind of turns into this economy based on trade, that was right in the Dutch wheelhouse. That was exactly what they were built to do, and they were way ahead of everybody else. And they cornered a lot of the spice trade coming from Southeast Asia. One last thing we'll say about this is that they created the first joint stock company. And it's known as the Dutch East India Company. Although we might know it better by the Dutch abbreviation VOC. So what a joint stock company is a company that sells stock to get money to do business. So kind of think of them as an early corporation. And they won't be the last one. The British are going to have the British East India Company. There's going to be a French East India Company. So most of the major powers of Europe are going to have one of these companies, mostly because the business of the 17th century and into the 18th century is trade. And that's how your economy works. And these companies are basically like extensions of the government doing trade in the government's name. So it's basically a government-run company that does business for the government. All right, so let's talk a little bit about Dutch society, because this is kind of a different situation than what we saw in England. So let's take a second and kind of stop and look around and see what this does to Dutch society. So let's look at Dutch. So, as we've said, the Dutch monarch, technically called the stadtholder, was limited by the merchant families. And so in this regard, it kind of looks a little bit like those Italian city-states during the Renaissance. So the stadtholder does have some power, but most of the actual decision making is in the hands of these merchant families. The one thing that the stadtholder does control is the military. The stadtholder is technically the guy in charge of the military. So he is the military leader. So unlike the traditional new monarchies we've talked about, the rural landowners in the Netherlands were virtually powerless. But some of the merchant families bought a noble title. So some of them would buy a title to appear noble, but really just having the money is enough to look the part of being noble. One last thing we'll mention here is that, like the English, we see a strong protection of property rights. And that's because at the end of the day, the nobility in England is very similar to the rich merchant families in the Netherlands. So the nobility and the merchants are very similar, and we're going to get a similar result in that both the Dutch and the English have the strong protection of property rights. So the difference between them is that the English are mostly these rural landowners, and that's where their power comes in. The Dutch are merchants, so they're not really from the countryside, they're from the cities. But the result is the same in that they both own stuff and they want the government to protect it. Now, as we move forward, the Dutch are going to get into a pretty big rivalry with the English in that they are both rising commercial superstars. Like, they're both really good at trade. It's just that the Dutch had a head start. Once the English get their stuff together, they're going to be a pretty big rival to the Dutch and eventually surpass the Dutch and kind of become the preeminent trading country in Europe. But for a time, it was the Dutch who were kind of running the economy of Europe. So for a little while, the Dutch were the main commercial power. And it's not because of their ability to trade, it's because of their military power. So this was kind of created through the military mind of the stadtholder. And the guy that we want to pay attention to, his name is William III of the House of Orange. So orange was the color of the Dutch royal family. So William III from the House of Orange. I think we've seen orange before in that portrait, the Arnolfini portrait. I think there are oranges in there, and I think that's a reference to the House of Orange. It should also be noted that this William III is also going to be the same William who marries Mary, and they eventually become king and queen of England. But that's not right now. That's in the future. So William III was a really good military leader, and he fought Charles and Louis XIV, who we will turn to after we finish with this subject. In fact, William was Louis's arch enemy. And Louis was really mad that William becomes King of England, because that was a much bigger, more powerful job than being stadtholder of the Dutch. And so this was a bigger threat to Louis than if he had simply been stadtholder of the Dutch. After William, the stadtholders were not nearly as talented, and the Dutch started to fall back. They're still rich, just not as powerful. One more point I want to make about the Dutch is that because the Dutch were pretty welcoming of refugees, especially religious refugees, a lot of people with, I guess we can call them unorthodox ideas, take root in Amsterdam. So Amsterdam was kind of seen as a place where people with weird ideas are free to express them and see where it takes them. So Amsterdam kind of becomes a heart of science and art. So, for instance, there's a large number of Dutch scientists for example, Christian Huygens, I think I'm pronouncing that wrong. He's the guy that invented the pendulum clock, which allows sailors to more accurately determine longitude. He also explained why Saturn has rings. So there are some examples of Dutch scientists. We'll look at a few more when we get to the scientific revolution. And of course, the big Dutch artist, the most famous of which was Rembrandt, who we looked at his painting, The Prodigal Son. But there's also just a bunch of Dutch painters that are called the Dutch masters. So these were masters of Baroque painting. So the Dutch being kind of welcoming to refugees allows a lot of these more unorthodox ideas to flourish, whereas they might be stomped out in other places. The last place that I want to take just a very brief look at is Poland. Now, again, Poland is another limited monarchy. But here, Poland is limited because here, the nobility won against the king. So in Poland, we have a very strong nobility, and they actually elect the king, as opposed to the king kind of bossing the nobility around. The nobility bossed the king around in Poland. The idea here is that no one nobleman actually let me start that over. So no action can be taken to hurt a nobleman without their approval. So they actually have a veto. It's called a liberum veto. What this means is that it requires unanimous action to do anything. So all the nobles have to be in line for anything to happen. They all have to agree. So all the nobles have to agree. I guess in theory, this means that you have a slow, deliberate government to create consensus. And that's not a bad idea. I mean, that's kind of the whole theory behind the American Constitution, is that it's supposed to be slow and deliberate to force people to create consensus. But in practice, this means that it's just rife with corruption, because any one noble can stop anything. And really, if you just bribe one of them, if you just bribe a noble, you could get him to stop just about anything from happening. And this is a really dangerous time to have a slow and deliberate government, because the problem with Poland is that they are surrounded by absolute monarchs who can move much faster. Poland moves slowly. Absolute monarchs can move very, very quickly because there's no one they have to work with. Whatever the king or the queen wants, they do. So what ends up happening is that, we'll put this down here, Poland gets eaten up by their absolutist neighbors. Austria, Russia, and Prussia. So because Poland moves so slowly, they end up getting swallowed up. They get taken apart by Austria, Prussia, and Russia, to the point where in 1795, Poland disappears. And they become a Russian protectorate. And they won't show back up on the map of Europe until 1918, after the Paris Peace Conference. All right, so that's it on limited monarchies. So we've talked about 3 different limited monarchies, and each one was a little bit different. We're now going to turn our attention to the other big political distinction in time period 2, which is absolute monarchy. So we're going to spend some time in France hanging out with Louis XIV. We'll also take a quick trip over to Russia to hang out with Peter for a little while. But until then, this is Mr. Nissen signing off.